Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Looks like it's going to be a beautiful day, first day of October. So the nights are starting to feel a little fallish. Have y'all seen the moon the last couple of days?
Yes.
It's so beautiful. Beautiful moon. So we're thankful for these beautiful days that we get, thankful for the Lord's Day that we have this opportunity to come together and study the Bible. That's what God wants us to do so we can know what His will is for us. And so we're thankful that we have the opportunity to do that. So if you would, let's try to sing, turn in your songbooks, number 303, Just Over in the Glory Land. We'll try to sing the first and the last verse. And then Brother Lane will lead us in a prayer, and then we'll have our Bible study class. Number 303, Just Over in the Glory Land, first and last verse. All right, let's all sing out. I've a home prepared where the saints abide, just over in the glory land. And I long to be by my Savior's side, just over in the glory land. Just over in the glory land, I'll join the happy angel band. Just over in the glory land, just over in the glory land, there with the mighty host I'll stand, just over in the glory land. With the blood-washed throng I will shout and sing, just over in the glory land. Glad hosannas to Christ the Lord and King, just over in the glory land. Just over in the glory land, I'll join the happy angel band, just over in the glory land. Just over in the glory land, there with the mighty host I'll stand, just over in the glory land.
Let's pray. I'd like to Lord for this day we have to be here to worship you, studying the word. Pray for all the ones who are sick, pray that you be with them. Pray might be your will, we can be healed, be back with us. Be with all the ones that's lost loved ones, let it be. Pray that you'll be with each one of us here, protect us from all evil and temptations in the world. Pray that we'll be able to let the laws and pray them into the church, pray the church here might grow. Thank you for all the many blessings that you've given us. Pray that you'll be with us and forgive us our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. If you all would be turning in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24. So we kind of introduced Matthew 24, I guess it was a week before last. So we talked about how this chapter has been confusing for a lot of people. And it was to me as well, and you talk to different people and you get different things, but the more I have studied this, and I've studied this quite a bit over the last few years, and to me now it makes sense. I mean, it's much simpler, but I know for a while I was confused as well, so a lot of people are, but it goes back to this idea of what does God want our attitude toward the Bible to be? What does He want us to do? Read and study it, right? And so the more I've studied this chapter, the clearer it has become to me. So that's proof positive, at least for me, which I don't really need any proof. If God said it, it's true. So if God tells me to study the Bible, then what do I need to do? Maybe I ought to study the Bible. Maybe I should do what God said. But the more I study, the more I understand, and the more things become clear. So to me, it seems like this chapter is not nearly as intimidating or daunting as it would have been for me even 5 or 10 years ago, because I have put a lot of time into it. So as we noticed last week, after Jesus finishes his last public discourse, at least the last one that is recorded, and this is the last week of his earthly life, the apostles privately ask him some questions that they want to have some answers for if Jesus is willing to provide those, and he will. He's going to answer these questions. And so as we said, if you look at Matthew and Luke and you combine the two accounts, but Matthew 24 and Luke 21, you see that there are 4 questions that are asked, but really 2 of them are about the same thing, and then the other 2 are about the same thing. So really you can condense those 4 questions down into 2 basic questions. So question number 1, they are asking him about the destruction of the temple. When is that going to happen? Are there going to be any signs? How are we going to know that this is going to happen? And then secondly, they ask him about his second coming. When is the world going to end? Okay? Now, their misconception, and a lot of other people's misconception, was what? Why do they ask him all this together? What do they think the destruction of the temple is? Do they think that's the same thing as the end of the world? Yes, they do, which it isn't. It's 2 completely different things. But they were showing once again they didn't have a full comprehension of what, so they're kind of lumping all this in together, but really it's 2 very distinct questions. Okay, what's going to happen with the destruction of the temple, and what about the end of the world? 2 different things. And Jesus is going to clarify that in this chapter.
This magnifies what you said at the beginning about us studying the Bible. They're right there. They're with him. And they don't understand that.
Yeah.
So it sort of doesn't justify us not understanding, but it sort of points out that it's easy to misunderstand or not know.
It is.
If you don't study.
If you don't study. So, like I said, for most of my life, I didn't really understand this chapter. And why didn't I understand it? Why do you think I didn't understand it? It's okay to say it. I didn't study it. Okay? Oh, I read over it. I relied on preachers to tell me what it meant. And like I said, when I actually started studying it, I got different interpretations from different people. And I knew that couldn't be right. I was like, look, I've just got to dig into this and really focus verse by verse and figure out. And so the more I've studied it, as I said, now it's really pretty clear, I think, to me. So they're asking him because they think it's all one thing. But Jesus is going to distinctly separate the 2 questions. And we're going to see when we get to that, Lord willing, there is a transition. There is a definite breaking point between the answer to the first question and the answer to the second question. And once you get that, then the chapter's is pretty straightforward to understand. But we need to know that, Jesus is going to answer those 2 questions. He's going to answer them separately. And he's going to answer them in the order in which they were asked. So the first question, is it about the temple or the end of the world? Which one are they asking first?
Temple.
About the temple. Okay, and then and what about your coming, right? So verse 3 says, tell us when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming in the end of the world? When shall these things be? That's dealing with the temple. They don't know it. They think it's all together. But Jesus is going to separate them. When will these things be? Okay, let me talk about the temple first, and then I'll tell you about my return, my second coming. They are not related. So Jesus is not going to return when the temple is going to be destroyed. That's what they thought was going to happen. He's telling them in this chapter that's not, no. The temple's going to be destroyed, and then, so for right now, what's the separation between those two events as of today? When was the temple destroyed?
79.
You're close. 70 AD. 70 AD. Okay, so this is, if my math is correct, it's 2023, right? So roughly, how long has it been? Let's just round it out, make it real simple. It's been about how long? About 2,000 years, right? So there is definitely a difference between the destruction of the temple and the coming of the Lord. When is Jesus going to come back? We don't know. Nobody knows.
He knows now.
Yeah, I'd say he knows now. But in the Bible, when he was on earth, he said he didn't even know. He said, only my Father in heaven knows when I'll come back. So all these people that make these predictions, they don't have a clue. And everybody's made a prediction that's already passed. Guess what? Yeah. Were they correct? They were wrong. And there's been several people out there that keep making adjustments, right? I'm telling you, he's coming here, and then he didn't come. Well, okay, I meant that he's coming here. Okay, well, they just keep changing it. It's like, why don't you just admit you don't know? There's no shame in that. I freely admit I don't know. Nobody knows when Jesus might return today. He might return 5,000 years from now. We don't know. But it's clearly a distinct event different from the destruction of the temple. But from the apostles' point of view, neither event had happened yet, and so they just kind of lump it together. So Jesus is going to clear that up. So he said, first I'm going to tell you about the destruction of the temple. I'm going to answer your question about that. And then I'm going to sort of answer your question about the return. Because again, he's not going to give them a date of the return. At this point, like I said he didn't even know. But he is going to tell them some things about the second coming and the end of the world. Okay, so he's going to answer those too. All right, so last week we started, or week before last, we started looking at this first question about the destruction of the temple. And so we looked at verses 4 through 15 in chapter 24. So let's read that real quick again. And we looked at Jesus is going to give them some signs, because they asked him, what will be the signs? And so he's telling them there will indeed be signs about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And he's going to give them 7 signs. So let's read these verses 4 through 15 where he gives these signs. And Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. And these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Okay, so one real quick word there about verse 15. The last thing we just read, Jesus said, whoso readeth, let him understand. So whether he's talking about this chapter or really the whole Bible, what is he telling us?
Study.
Yeah, and can we understand it?
Yes.
Yeah, we can, but some of it's really cut and dried and very simple and straightforward. And then there's other parts like the book of Revelation, which we're studying on Wednesday night, which is a little more complicated, right? But he's telling us you can understand the things you need to understand if you put the time in and if you study it. And as I said, the more I've studied this chapter, the clearer it has become to me. And sometimes I'm kind of surprised. I'm like, why was I ever confused about this? But I was, because to me it seems pretty simple now. But for a long time it didn't. But that's because I wasn't studying it enough. Okay, so Jesus says here, you can understand. You read this, you can understand it. You can understand what I'm telling you. Okay? So, look at these signs, verses 4 and 5. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. He says there will be people that are going to come, they're going to claim to be me, they're going to tell you they're the Christ, they're the Messiah, and what about that?
It's false.
It's false, right? Jesus said, it's not me, okay? I'm not going to return before the destruction of the temple. When after Jesus is crucified, he's raised from the dead, he's going to be here for about 40 days, and then he's going to ascend into heaven. And he's telling them, I'm not coming back until the end of the world. I'm not going to come back for the destruction of the temple. But there's going to be plenty of people that are going to tell you they're me, they're not. Okay, so he's telling his apostles, don't let them deceive you. I'm telling you it's not me. Don't matter what they say. You know who I am, and I'm telling you it's not me. So he's trying to make that clear. People are very susceptible. Even today, people are susceptible to believe because they think that the end of the world is coming. Okay? So you got a lot of people today in 2023, you have a lot of people predicting this is the end of the world. Are there a lot of people today predicting this is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Pretty much all the time that happens, right? And so, Russia invaded Ukraine and that's Armageddon and you get all this stuff, right? They don't know. The premillennialists, which we're talking about on Wednesday night, they're big on, well, these are the end signs. Okay, Jesus saying, look, it's easy for people to be deceived when they think the end of the world is coming, but don't be deceived. So he's telling us that. He warns them, don't fall for this because these guys are not telling you the truth. Okay? Then sign number 2 we see in verse 6. We talked about it last time. There'll be wars and rumors of wars. But he says, but don't be troubled because all that has to come to pass. But the end is not yet. Just because there's wars being fought, rumors of wars. Well, in what time period in human history have there been wars and rumors of wars?
Pretty well.
Just pretty much, maybe not in the Garden of Eden, but shortly thereafter, right? So pretty much every time period in history has wars and rumors of wars. Okay, but Jesus is talking about here, obviously, it's got to be something different about it. So he's talking about it's going to come home to you. This is going to be close. It's not going to be some far off distant place, but it's going to more affect you. When you see that, then you'll know, again, the end is not here, but it's starting to get to that point. But again, we're talking about the end of the temple, not the end of the world. Okay? But he says, don't think that is the end, but it's kind of like the beginning of the end. When these things start really coming home to you, you can start getting ready because that means the temple destruction is coming up pretty soon. Okay? So we always have wars and rumors of wars, and that's why, again, people are saying, well, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was it. People said it, World War I, World War II, the Civil War, Vietnam. Any war that's fought, everybody thinks this is Armageddon, this is the last one. And nobody knows, okay? Because you always have that stuff. But he's telling them that this is going to come close to home to you, and it's going to be a little bit different because it's going to personally affect you. Okay? So just like us today, we got this war going on in Ukraine. Does that really affect you and me on a day-to-day basis? Not really. We pray for those people. We feel bad for those people because for them, they are directly affected. But most people are not directly affected. So he's telling them, when you start to become directly affected by these things, you're going to know the end is coming. Again, the end of the temple, not the end of the world. All right, so let's go then. This is where we left off. Sign number 3 is in verses 7 and 8. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. But notice, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Okay, so he's telling them, you're going to see these things happen, but that's not the end. But it's kind of the beginning of the end, right? When you see these things occur, you know the destruction of the temple is going to shortly follow. It's going to come pretty soon after this. Okay? And so we see these signs here that Jesus mentions specifically: famines, pestilences, earthquakes. 3 things he specifically mentions. And so again, you will have the premillennialists and people today saying, are we having famines today? Yes. Are we having pestilences? Yeah, we just had one like COVID. Are we having earthquakes? Yeah. Okay. When has human history not had those things? Pretty much always.
History repeats itself.
It does, yeah. So there's always been earthquakes. There's always been, right? So again, Jesus is talking about there's something different about these. You're going to notice. It's not just your run-of-the-mill things that are going to be happening, okay? Because they had earthquakes before and things like that. So he's saying there's going to be some pretty severe natural disasters that are going to occur pretty kind of close together. Bigger than normal, okay? The famines, the pestilences. And a pestilence, that's like a fatal epidemic outbreak of a disease. COVID would be a small example of that, and I'm not trying to minimize it, but I'm saying compared to other pestilences, COVID didn't kill nearly as many people, but you could call it a pestilence. It killed several million people. The Black Death would probably be the biggest one back in the 1300s. It wiped out about a third of Europe's entire population. That's a pestilence, right? So something where it's a big disease that kills a lot of people. And then you got the earthquakes. And so we can look at now the history books, which they couldn't. So when Jesus is telling them this, they don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but I think they understand that Jesus is saying this is going to be big. It's not going to be your run-of-the-mill disaster. So we can look back and say, okay, was there anything that took place? Again, the temple was destroyed in what year? 70 AD, right? So, looking back through history, all these things were occurring around that time. Okay, now hold your place here. Turn over to Acts chapter 11. Acts chapter 11. We want to see where Luke mentions, and this is, remember, this is in Acts. This is after Jesus has been crucified. Notice what Luke talks about here in Acts 11, beginning in verse 27. And in these days came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Okay? Now, what is a dearth? Anybody know? It's a famine. Okay? And so Luke says, a great famine throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. So Luke gives us a clue. How can we figure out what years this took place?
By the name of the ruler.
Claudius Caesar, the Roman emperor. And we know that he was emperor between 41 and 54 AD. So during that time period, there was a huge famine that affected almost everybody. Okay? And so famines, a lot of times, they're localized, right? And this area is really suffering, but not really everybody else. There was a tremendous famine when Claudius was emperor that affected almost everybody in the whole Middle Eastern. That's what Jesus was probably talking about. A great, not just a regular famine, but this one's going to be really big Well, history tells us that there was a really big famine preceding the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, what about the plague? Well, we also know that there was a plague that hit Rome in 65 AD, 5 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, that killed about 30,000 people. And for that time period, that's a lot of people to kill from a plague. So there were other diseases, of course, and people died all the time from communicable diseases. But you typically didn't have a disease that would come in that would wipe out that many. But there was one 5 years before the destruction of the temple. So most definitely that's what Jesus was referring to. He knew that was going to happen. And so he tells us, he says, so watch out for something like that. When you see that, you're going to know that the destruction of the temple is going to be pretty soon. Okay, it's not going to be a long way off. And then something else, there's always been earthquakes, and there were earthquakes at that time period, but there were four incredibly massive earthquakes that were bigger than the others between 46 and 64 AD. We know that now from the history books. Okay? So they were not just your average earthquake. These were devastating. There were 4 of them that occurred every few years during that period leading up to. And so these are signs. So Jesus is telling, when you see these things, you're going to know that the destruction of the temple is not too far off in the future. It's going to be fairly soon after this, okay? So that's sign number 3. You're going to see these natural disasters. Well, sign number 4, we see in verses 9 and 10. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Okay, so what he's telling us, which again, we can look in the history books and see, he's telling them the church is going to be especially heavily persecuted during the period leading up to the destruction of the temple. Okay, and this really kind of begins with Saul of Tarsus. Okay, now, who was Saul of Tarsus? Who's he going to become? Paul the Apostle, right? So he's going to convert. He's the one where Jesus confronts him on the road, right? Saul, Saul, why thou persecutest me? Right? And so Saul, that makes a believer out of him. And he's going to convert. He becomes known as Paul the Apostle. Probably the greatest or among the greatest of all the servants that we read about in the New Testament. But before that, what did Saul do? He persecuted the church, which included killing Christians. And remember, Saul said that, or Paul said, back in those days, he said, I did all that with a good conscience. Right? I thought I was serving God by killing Christians. But he literally and figuratively saw the light and changed his ways and repented for that. But Jesus is telling them there's going to be this massive persecution of the church in these decades leading up to the destruction of the temple. Now, after Paul was converted, the Jews are going to continue to persecute the church. The Roman government is going to continue to persecute the church. And we talked a little bit about why that is when we're studying Revelation, because the Romans expected all of their loyal citizens in spiritual matters to do what? There were times of emperor worship, right, or worship their gods. They had a multitude of gods. And of course, the Christians refused to do that. And so they were refusing basically direct orders from the emperor to do this. And so they're going to be heavily persecuted. Okay, we studied earlier that, again on Wednesday night, we saw that John, the Apostle John, he's going to be banished to an island. Does anybody remember the name of it? Giving you some hard quiz questions today. Patmos, right. So he's going to be banished to Patmos. To the best of our knowledge, and the Bible doesn't give us so we're going from secular records. to the best of our knowledge, all the other apostles will be killed. John is the only one that we know of that just died of old age, that he lived long, and we know that, Revelation, as we talked about, was written about 94, 95 AD. Okay, Jesus, when he's telling them this is around 33 AD. So John's going to get that vision about 60 years into the future after this. But all the apostles, they're going to be killed for the name of Christ. And in verse 9, he said, they'll deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. You shall be hated of all nations for my sake. Okay, and all those things come true. So, but he's saying, when you see this really heavy persecution, that's another sign that the destruction of the temple is not going to be too far off. When you see that both the Jews and the Romans are going to ramp up their persecution of the church. Now, why do you think it's going to get worse? The persecution. What do you think is happening that gets the Romans' attention? Just in a general sense.
People are beginning to listen.
Yeah, the church is growing, right? And so the more the church grows, the bigger the threat the Romans perceive it to be, and that's when they're really going to crack down on it. Okay? So, again, that's sign number 4. Well, sign number 5, verses 11 through 13. And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. So again, he earlier said there's going to be a lot of people claiming to be Christ. They're not me, don't listen. Now he says there's also going to be a lot of people, they're not claiming to be Christ, but they are claiming to be prophets of God. I'm a messenger of God. I'm a spokesman for God, and the Lord told me to tell you to do this. What's Jesus telling them about those people? They're false. They're liars. So don't be deceived. Don't listen to them. They are not genuine prophets from God. But there's going to be a lot of them that are going to be around, and the more of those you see, the closer to the destruction of the temple we're getting. So that's another sign that will help you to recognize. He says, don't fall for what they're selling. Don't buy what they're selling because it's all false. But he's saying that a lot of people are going to be deceived. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to fall for it. Just like today, again, you've got all these false teachers out there, false preachers, and so many people in the world fall for this false doctrine. Primarily, especially in our time period, they fall for it because what are these people telling them? Are they telling them what they want to hear? It's all about the love of Jesus. You can live anyway. Go ahead and sin. It's okay. Jesus is going to save you because he loves you. Well, yeah, he does love me, but he's also going to condemn me if I don't do what he said. Well, they leave that part out. So they comfort people. They give people false security. They say, hey, you're okay. You're going to heaven. It's fine. That's a great message. We'd all love to hear that. And so it deceives a lot of people. Well, it's the same thing here. He says all these people, they're going to tell people what they want to hear, and a lot of people are going to be deceived, but don't fall for it. But in verse 13, he shall endure until the end, the same shall be saved. That's a message for them. Is that also a message for us?
Yes.
Endure to the end, Revelation 2:10, be faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Okay? Don't fall for the false stuff. Don't cave into the world. Don't go back like the pig wallowing in the mud. Don't do that. Stay faithful, endure, and you will be saved. Okay? So it's just as much a message for us as it was for them in the first century. Okay? So then we get to sign number 6, which is in verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Okay? So he's saying the gospel is going to be preached throughout this entire area. And look at Colossians 1 and verse 23. We want to see that Paul tells us that this was accomplished And he's talking about this. This is around 63 AD, which would be about 7 years before the destruction of the temple. Paul said this was accomplished, Colossians 1 and verse 23. If you continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which ye have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Okay? And he's really talking about the world that was known to them, that was reachable to them. They went everywhere, and the Bible tells us they went everywhere preaching the gospel. Okay? And so Jesus said, once that has been accomplished, then you know the destruction of the temple is not going to be too far behind that. And so again, if you read what Paul said, this is around 63 AD, saying this has been accomplished. You know, we've done what Jesus told us to do. Now they're going to keep teaching and preaching as new people will be born. But he's saying we've gone to all this area, we've gone everywhere that we could go to, and everybody's at least had a chance to hear it. Doesn't mean they'll obey it, but they've had a chance to hear it. And as we said, that's our obligation. Our obligation is not to convert people. Our obligation is to do what? Well, how do we help them? Teach them. That's our obligation. I can't make them obey the gospel, but I'm responsible for at least trying to share. Now, they may spit in my face, and I may not get 5 words out of my mouth. I may not get to preach the whole gospel to them, but I'm to make the effort. And then if they slam the door in my face, well, okay. I tried to teach them. Right? So God's not going to hold us accountable. Well, that guy that you went to his house and he slammed the front door in his face, you should have broke the door down, and you should have gone in there and pushed him onto the ground and sat on top of him and beat the gospel into him. We don't have to do that. We're not supposed to do that, right? So, but what we're accountable for is making the effort to try to teach the gospel to people. Some people will reject it right off the bat. Some people might listen to some of it. Make the effort. So they had done that. They had taught the gospel. Everybody had a chance to hear it. And so Jesus said the temple will be destroyed after this has been accomplished. Okay? Now, then we get to sign number 7. And you've had all kinds of people talk about all kinds of things about this. But again, with a little study, I think we can understand what this means. We see this in verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So this is kind of the final. So this is Jesus saying, you're going to see all these other signs. Here's the last sign. When you see this, it's time for the temple to be destroyed, okay? So we got to figure, what is the abomination of desolation? So do you think this is something that they would be able to recognize? Should be able to, this is something that should be obvious to them, that they would know, okay, man, this is it. This is, the temple's about to be destroyed right now. All these other signs happen. It still may be a little ways off. You get to this, we're here. Here we are. So it's got to be something that they would recognize, that it would just jump out to them. This is the last sign. Okay, this is what we've been looking for. Okay, and so what is this reference? What does it mean, the abomination of desolation? Well, it refers to the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem. Okay, when the Roman army marches on Jerusalem and they surround the city, that's the abomination of desolation. When you see that, you know that the end has come. The end of the temple, not the end of the world, but the end of the temple. Okay, the holy place here says stand in the holy place. That's talking about the city of Jerusalem. Why was it called the holy place? Because that's where God's temple was, right? And as we've seen, Jesus is telling the Pharisees, it's no longer God's temple because you've desecrated it. It's your desolate home now. It was the home of God, but it's not anymore. But he still referred, this has been for you, this has been the holy place, the holy city of Jerusalem. Okay, so there's a clue there. He's talking about this is going to happen, which of course that's where the temple is. Where else would it happen, right? So the holy place refers to the city of Jerusalem. Now, this is made a little bit more clear when you look at Luke's account. So I want you to turn over to Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21. Let's look at verse 20. So Luke lays it out even more specifically than Matthew does. Luke 21 and verse 20. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed, which means compassed, which means surrounded, but with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. What does nigh mean? Near. It's on us. Yeah, it's very close. Okay, so when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the Roman armies, you know the temple is about to fall. Okay, that's going to happen. It's nigh. Okay, and so let's look over, turn over to Daniel chapter 9. And we're just going to read a couple verses at the end of the chapter, but in chapter 9 he makes reference to this. Okay, and this is what Jesus is talking about when he says the abomination of desolation. But Daniel 9, let's look at the last two verses, starting with 26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. This is the abomination of desolation. So Daniel prophesied about it. Jesus saying this is what it's going to be. So the phrase is appropriate here as we close out, because again, we can look back at history. The apostles, they don't know how bad this is going to be. We do, because we can read about it. What did the Romans do when they got there? Well, let me tell you, kids, it ain't pretty. Okay, what happened here? Okay, Josephus was a historian who he tells us about what the Romans did when they surrounded the city and when they destroyed the city. And you can read all the details, the gory details, if you want to. And I've got his book in my office where Josephus describes all this. But the actions of the Romans were brutal. The best comparison I can make is what the Nazis did in the Holocaust. That's the level that there were more in the Holocaust because there were a lot more people there in the 1930s and 40s. But it's very similar to the actions of what the Romans did to the Jews as to what the Germans did to the Jews. Similar type stuff, okay? Now, Josephus, just to tell you something about him, he's born in Jerusalem. He was a Jew, okay? But he was a Pharisee. And he collaborated with the Romans. In other words, he worked with them. And so how do you think the Jews viewed him? Because he worked with the Romans, who they hated.
Not too good.
Yeah, not too good, right? They saw him as a sellout. And how did the Romans see him? The Romans didn't trust him either because he was a Jew, and in a sense, they saw him as a traitor to his own people. Well, how can you trust a guy like that, right? So Josephus, he kind of got enemies on both sides. But he gives us a really good historical account of what happened in this siege of Jerusalem. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it, Lord willing, next week. It is brutal, the things that happen. And so Jesus calls it the abomination of desolation. Okay, and when this happens, that's the end is there. And then we're going to see, what does he tell them? When you know the end is here, what do you do about it? That'll be in the next section. Any questions or comments? All right, let's take a break for a few minutes and have our worship service.